Greeting, Professor Jerome. We greet you today in the frameworks of the project City as a Classroom. So, I have prepared some questions, so we can start.
I saw all the questions that you have, and they're sufficient to write another book. So I hope I can do a good job in answering your questions today. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you for you. So, first question. Dear Professor Jerome, could you please explain your vision of visual sociology and its effectiveness in our time?
I've been doing visual sociology probably for 60 years, I think. But not until the 1990s did I decide to call myself a visual sociologist. And the reason for that is, I think, is very important, is that what occurs in the social sciences and the humanities are a number of specializations. So I was trained as an anthropologist and a sociologist. And I have always thought it was important to be looking closely at cities, you know, particularly in terms of neighborhoods, and looking at the small scale and the large scale. And it didn't occur to me until probably the 1990s how important it was to my work, to my theorizing, and to my practical work, the importance of what things look like. And so I then started, in a sense, an adventure of writing about the importance of seeing in social research, which was often not directly referred to. So I even went back into the reading of the classics in social sciences and discovered that often what theorists were writing about, they were writing about the world that they saw. And that stimulated them to talk about things. You know, for example, like Georg Simmel, etc., in The Metropolis and Mental Life, spoke about what things actually look like and how important it was. And so that's how it started. And then I joined with other people in organizations like the International Visual Sociology Association, who were involved in visual research. Interesting is that many of them were much better, in my opinion, at photography and filmmaking than they were in the sociological analysis. To me, this is what's important, is the sociology. It has to be central to it. I'm not a photographer, even though I take pictures. To me, what it is I see and what I take pictures of and use, those things are data. And those things are data to be interpreted and to be written about. And what's important is for us to understand why things look like they do, right? In other words, it's not so important that things look like they do, but why do they look that way? And then also, why do people feel certain ways about the things that they see? So, for example, one of my first books, studies, was essentially an African-American community where I lived. And I was struck by the fact that people saw the neighborhood that I lived as a negative place, as a place, and I wrote about stigma. And it seemed to me that, you know, as I was walking around and talking with my neighbors and working with them, that my neighborhood was a very nice place. Yet people, particularly outsiders, particularly white populations, white people, were afraid to come into my neighborhood. You know, and it then, of course, dawned on me, as it should have dawned on me a long time ago, that it had a lot to do not with what my neighborhood looked like, but with what they, how they interpreted what it is that they look like. And that has followed through in most of what I've done since then. So I've walked and photographed through probably hundreds of cities around the world, and basically finding the same thing. I'm not looking for anything at all. What I want to do is I want to experience the city, experience the neighborhood in some ways like you're expressing it as a classroom. I'm also a student, and so I learn about cities. I learn about social life. I learn about people by walking through their neighborhoods, and observing it, and being as objective as I possibly can, uh, and trying to first of all explain to myself why it is I feel this way about the places I walk through. I've written a couple of times about this as a central issue. We walk through neighborhoods like we're tourists. We're looking at things, and we have to consider, why is it that this makes us afraid? Why does this appear to us to be welcoming? Why do we think these people are dangerous? Why do we think these people aren't dangerous? This is social life. In other words, if you look at social life, starting with the idea of the visual, it leads to so many other things. So what I stress in my work is to try to get people who are sociologists or other social scientists to take more seriously, to make more central what things look like in their work, and not to be something that is something that comes afterwards. For example, there's quite a sociology of visual sociology, and visual approaches are more frequently used nowadays. I mean, the technology has made it easier for people to incorporate images and video in their work. But often the image is an afterthought, or it's an illustration of, as opposed to being the source of. Right? So somebody wants to write about racism, they'll write about racism, and then they'll throw in a couple of photographs, or they'll throw in a movie as an illustration of what it is they were talking about. For me, it really is the reverse. In other words, someone should be looking at a movie and deciding for yourself that it's about race, and talking about how race is depicted in the film, right? And how people respond to it. So that's the way. And also consider this, that when we look at something, the pictures that we take of that thing are different from the thing in the first place, right? So we always have to remember that as well. That what it is that people and communities present themselves in life, right? And then we, as the social scientists, go around and we observe, we describe, we talk about, and we take pictures. And that product of ours is different from the original. So we always have to realize that too, and to recognize that we're also biased.
Second question is, what changes in the structure of city are the most significant, and how do they influence the relations between people?
That's a difficult question because the most of the emphasis on observing change in cities, which and it's the correct thing to do, is to look at it from the point of view of technology. Sorry, I have my throat is not too good today. And to look at it in terms of technology. So the major things that have changed cities have been like transportation technology, building technology. Now the technology is virtual technology, is internet technology, etc. And each of these things have drastically changed the cities. And the rapidity of change has increased and is increasing. And, and each of these technological changes affects how people interact with one another as well. So oddly, strangely, you might think, if we look at a city like New York, the building technology and transportation technology and communication technology has actually resulted in more segregation of different classes and ethnic groups. Because they no longer need to be directly sharing space with one another. And so that's a kind of interesting thing for us to see. And so if we look at a city like New York, increasingly the borough, the center of the city, Manhattan, is becoming more and more homogeneous as far as class and race is concerned. And I believe that that's a direct consequence of the changes in technology, which no longer require people to be close to one another and to be interacting with each other, right? So the more interactions you have, the more likely you are to interact with people who are different from you. And that's happening less and less. So I would say, for example, if you look at somebody who works, not today, because so much of the COVID has decreased jobs. But if you think about people who work on Wall Street, let's say they're brokers, et cetera, they work on Wall Street. They work in a single place. They interact only with each other. They live in buildings where it's only people like them. They travel to work. Maybe that's one of the few places they might mix if they use public transportation, right? Then when they go on vacation, they go to places where only they are. And the kinds of people who are different from them, who serve them, for example, they have very little interaction with them. They don't interact to any great degree with the service workers in their building. They don't interact very much with the people who clean the places where they work. They don't interact much with the service workers in the places where they go on vacation, right? So it's kind of interesting that technology has increased the likelihood of this kind of a segregation and separation, particularly between people in the higher levels of society and the lower levels, even though so many people in the lower levels are serving these people, but they're not interacting. There's not much to the social interaction between them. I would even say, if you look at somebody who is living in an expensive apartment, that their apartment is cleaned by people, but that's increasingly also being done by services, by more or less anonymous people. So they're kind of passing each other in space, but never meeting and interacting. So I think that's the major change. The major one today, I think, as I mentioned to you, is the communications technology, particularly internet and the personal communications. What you see also in the cities, which is kind of odd, when people are even in crowds where they have the opportunity to interact with one another, they're very frequently they're on a cell phone, right? And even worse, they're on a cell phone where they're not holding it in their hand. Well, at least that's something. But they have the earbuds, and it's a Bluetooth earbuds. So we see people in a crowd, and I do this. I photograph this also. For example, in a park setting, and I see people sitting in crowds, etc. And occasionally they're talking to each other, of course, but more frequently. I go out in the morning, I run, and people have these earbuds on, and they're listening to music, or they're carrying on conversations with people who are elsewhere, right? So they're not talking to me, they're not talking to the people around them. So it looks like the same crowd, right? but it's not. So I've been running getting more and more slow, of course, as I get older. So if I were to have a photograph, if I had a photograph, when I first started running maybe 40 years ago, I would see the same number of people, right? Jogging along, and I would have many more of them saying, something like, "Get out of the way, you're too slow," or something like that. They might say hello, they might say goodbye, etc. Whereas now, same number of people, but there's no talking to one another, right? Even when I see people talking, what seems to be in groups, many of them have the iPods in their ears, and if they're having a conversation, all of a sudden their conversation will be interrupted because they got a call, from work or from family. So I think that's a major thing, and it's changing the character of our cities. And I think, I'm glad to see, although the tragedy of George Floyd's death, these Black Lives Matter demonstrations, we see many people in the street, and in some ways, even though it's bad for COVID, in a sense, it shows me some kind of hope that people who are different from one another are engaging with one another in the public space, and that's reflected in turn by, if you look at the social media, and we see that multiplied also. So that's a kind of an interesting thing where the media, electronics, can be used, to bring people together. But what makes for a city, I think one of the questions you had was this city mentality that I mentioned. It comes from the Zimmel with Metropolis and Mental Life. Is how does an urban person talk about? What does a city person talk about? How do they think? How do they move, etc.? And it was always this idea of interacting with others and the likelihood of being able to interact with people from whom you're different, right? So that's you can live in a tribal space, you can live in a compound, any place in the world, but you're with your relatives, you're with your clansmen, you're with your kinsmen, etc. But what makes for a city is coming out of those spaces and interacting with people with whom you're different, different classes, different ethnic groups, different religions, etc. And even though these interactions, they may not be positive, people may not like each other, right? But that's social life. That's what social life is all about. It's not being, an automaton, being somebody different, separated from everybody else, and only connected electronically. Somebody's feeding you. Somebody's growing something, and it's coming to you and it's eating. If you think about some of those science fiction movies, where there's never any contact and the thing is delivered to you, the robot is doing it on the spacecraft, etc. For me, that's an end of social life, right? It's an end of social life. You have retreated inside your own mind, where you always are anyhow, but you're not touching anybody else, right? It's not the same. That's why cities were so important for the evolution of just about everything. Jane Jacobs talked about cities being places actually where agricultural innovation took place, because people came to the market and they shared things, and they had products, etc. Well, that's what it's all about. If you think about why China, right, is now doing so extremely well in so many different kinds of things. I don't know whether you've been to China, but it's a different feel there. It's a feel of masses of people together doing things, coming together, etc. And I think that's where, again, particularly in terms of the future, the innovation will take place. If they go the same route that it seems that's going on in New York City, where we see the separation, I think that that would be devastating in terms of innovation. Right now in American cities, again, we're seeing more and more of this higher elite classes, etc., moving themselves away from other people, moving in, instead of using public schools, and moving their children into private schools, and the private schools become more and more elite, right? And their kids then go from that elite private school to an elite college, to an elite job, to an elite place to live, etc. I think that was the downfall of the British Empire. Is this the separations of people, and that kind of rigid class structure, which limits the ability of people to be mobile, to be economically mobile, to be socially mobile.
Okay, I get it. So the next question, please, is you have been researching Brooklyn for many years. Have you ever compared Brooklyn to other cities? If yes, which ones would be the closer to it?
You really don't live in a big place. Human beings don't live in a big place, right? You may be situated in Odessa. I may be situated in Brooklyn, but I live in a neighborhood. And I live in a neighborhood. I live in a neighborhood which a lot of people are describing it now as super gentrified, hyper gentrified, super diverse, etc. Most of the people that are using those terms, they have very little idea about actually what's happening, right? So when I look in my neighborhood and I see my neighbors, most of them are middle income, upper middle income people, the variety of different ethnic groups. There are very few African Americans. But there are other groups, etc. And that kind of thing, I think you can replicate. You can find in different places where there's middle class neighborhoods. When I go in Brooklyn and I look at a Bangladeshi neighborhood, right, or I go to Brooklyn and I look at an Italian neighborhood, I look at an Orthodox Jewish neighborhood, etc. I can find places like that.
One of your research interests is Italian communities in Brooklyn. What are the peculiarities of Italian communities, and what makes them different from others?
That's been a long time project that I've been involved in. As kind of a strange thing for many people. Usually what happens is in the social sciences, people focus on one thing and they stay with that, to the exclusion of all other things, right? And you should realize that my study of Italian neighborhoods in Brooklyn came about from my study of African-American neighborhoods in Brooklyn, right? In other words, looking at how people saw Black neighborhoods made me start to think about other groups that have images or stereotypes of neighborhoods, right? So when I was doing my work on African-American neighborhoods, and I was looking at this stigma, in other words, this idea that even middle and upper middle income Black neighborhoods were perceived as slums, even though if you went into the neighborhood, they weren't. They weren't run down and they weren't dirty, etc. But there was an image in the mind of what these neighborhoods were like, and also an image of the people who live in those neighborhoods, right? So that's where it's where it started. A friend of mine, and I'm also, you may also know, I'm an activist. I'm very much involved in, activism, neighborhood organizing, all kinds of things. And, so what happened was a friend of mine who was active in the Italian-American community knew about my work in the Black community and said, "Well, Jerry, you're half Italian. My mother's family is from Sicily." He said, "Why don't you get involved with the Italians?" And I said, "Well, okay, sure." And I did. And one of the big problems at that time for Italian neighborhoods in Brooklyn was this stereotype of Italian Americans and Italian American neighborhoods in terms of being backward, in terms of not being progressive, in terms of so many other things. It's mafia dominated and all those kinds of stereotypes of those neighborhoods. And so I got involved in community organizing in Italian neighborhoods in order to address problems. There was another stereotype of the Italian American community was that they didn't have any problems. There was this stereotype of Italian American neighborhoods. They're solid communities. They have no crime. They have, etc. What I also discovered, of course, is that that wasn't true. I also discovered that the Italian American kids, too many of them weren't doing well in school. I found a lot of social problems within the Italian community, which was contrary to the stereotype, right? So that's what I began to study in doing activism. Now, while I was doing that work, since I also like to photograph, right? I began to realize that these neighborhoods that I was looking at all over New York City, I actually was a founder of a citywide Italian-American organization called AMICO, American Italian Coalition of Organizations. What I found out is I traveled around to these different places. Remember, a lot of people live in a city, they never travel anywhere. They stay in their own neighborhood and they go to work and they come home, right? So I went to all these neighborhoods and they all had a visual similarity. Certain colors, certain kinds of stores, the way they behave, their front gardens, the way they decorated their houses, even the kinds of things that they wore and the way that they socialized in public. I saw all those things and I photographed them, of course, right? I wrote an article for an architecture and design magazine in which I outlined these similarities. Well, I can't read them off the top of my head, but some of the things which are not unique to Italians. I mean, again, there's nothing that's unique to anybody. What's unique is the combination of things, right? Right. So one of the most important things that I found in the Italian American community was this emphasis on private property being important, but not public property, right? It's very, very important to see this. Now, there's a great deal of concern for what the front of your house looks like, what the image of your house is like. If you have a garden in front, it's very important, and you're going to decorate it in your way. You're very concerned about the sidewalk in front of your house where people walk. You're even concerned about the curb, the street in front of your house. And there's also this idea that since you're focused on private property, there's the idea of expropriation of public space. In other words, that the space in front of your house, which is public, is really your property. And you're concerned about it, and you're concerned about who walks on it, who uses it, who stands there, etc. And this I found common throughout the Italian neighborhoods. And the visual similarities too, not necessarily exactly the same thing, but the same uses of it, the same kinds of flowers, the same kinds of plants, for example. Italian American culture, for example, because of this private look, is very concerned and more secretive. This is one of the things I compared when I did the stuff on Polish neighborhoods. Polish windows tend to be more open. If they have a window dressing, it's something that's sheer that you can see through. Italians, on the other hand, tend to be covered, right? So there's this idea of not wanting to for people to be looking inside the house, right? Whereas Poles will put flowers in their front windows because they want to show show that they're good people, etc. I'll talk about that if you want later. you know, so those things were there, and this resulted, by the way. Now here's what's important. You know, it's not simply how nice things look, but also that was a cause of problems when people who Italian Americans thought ought not be in their neighborhood, right? So what they had is they had this thing where they're concerned about themselves, they're concerned about their families. They tended to have their children or their whatever living within the same neighborhood. Neighborhoods were that I observed were more or less homogeneous, right? And they tended to only rent and only to sell to family members or other Italians, etc. They're very wary of other groups, right? Very defensive, right? And that was a stereotype, but it was a true stereotype, right? And I don't know whether you remember or know about this. There were a number of different incidents in New York City where people of color ran into problems in Italian neighborhoods, right? So that's kind of an interesting thing. And so part of my work also was in terms of educating people, trying to get people to be more accepting of others. It didn't work too much for Italians because the phenomenon for Italian Americans in Brooklyn was that as the borough began to change, as it became more and more African American, Caribbean, Latino, etc., and now Chinese, now Asian, the Italian Americans moved out. You know, they were the last group to move out of the city in large numbers, but they moved out. And what they did is they reaccumulated. In other words, they went to other places that became Italian American enclaves, right?
Okay, so you say about the methods. Please, could you please speak about your methods of research?
There's a basic, simple method that I use. What I do, sometimes it's accidental. Okay, I'm not going to talk about the accidental, right, which occurs frequently. I carry a camera with me all the time, right? Mm-hmm. But if I'm doing real research, right, what I do first is I study. I read about and I watch. For example, if I'm interested in Chinese communities, Chinatowns. I do a lot of work in Chinatowns, right? So I've been in Chinatowns throughout my life, etc., but I didn't study Chinatown. When I decided to study Chinatown, right, I read about Chinatown. I read about what other people wrote about Chinatown. I read about what their experiences were. I was particularly important to read about Chinese people talking about Chinatown, right? Because it's different than talking about people who see Chinatowns as exotic, etc. There's a lot of literature on that, even film about that. And that you have to pay attention to that too, because that tells you where people get their ideas about these Chinatowns, right? Chinatowns are like Little Italy, you know, the same kind of a stereotype. Dangerous, dark, murky, etc. And so, yeah, I do that. In other words, you do the research, and the research is like reading, listening, watching, etc. And then what I like to do, my method, right, which is not something exclusive to myself, is I like to walk, right? And so what I'll do is I'll look frequently if I'm going to, particularly if I'm going to a place I haven't been before, is I'll come up with a map, right? In other words, you know, somebody's going to say, well, this is Chinatown in Chicago. This is Chinatown in Los Angeles. This is Chinatown in San Francisco. So I'll have the map. And then what I'll try to do, if I have the time, is I'll try to walk through it. Chinatown, Boston, Chinatown, Philadelphia, Chinatown, Washington, D.C., right? That's how many Chinatowns I've been and more. And I have the map, and I say to myself, okay, well, this is where I'm going to do. And I take my camera. I don't use an expensive camera. I use point and shoot. I take more snapshots because I don't want to say I'm a photographer. I don't bring expensive equipment out and set it up, etc. To photograph, because I want to have the experience of, as I said, walking through the space, you know, and responding to it. And frequently, most frequently, what I do is I take photographs. I don't like to do video, right? I don't like to do video. I like to take shots. Most often, I'm really not even looking through the lens, right? So I've kind of developed it, so I'm walking through. If I notice something I'm particularly interested in, then I'll focus on it, and I'll for that. I make sure that I take photographs which give me markers, right? In other words, that if I can go back to them, maybe a street sign or something or other, so that it's there. I tell my students, do not take notes while you're doing this, because if you take notes, people will then respond to you. In other words, so you'll be taking photographs of people looking at somebody who's taking pictures and taking notes, and that's not what you want. You want to see what people are doing ordinarily, that you're just a piece of furniture that's in the neighborhood. All right, and I walk through. If I can, I'll walk through more than once. If I can, I'll do it at different times a day, etc. But in most cases, I don't have that ability. I'm not someone with large sums of money that can do this. It would be great. I did it in Krakow as I took a group of students and we went through and we photographed. And then we compared what it is that we had. In fact, my Krakow students at the Jagiellonskie University, I gave them my photographs in 1997 that they saw beforehand. And then we went out 2 years ago and rephotographed, right? That's a nice project to do. And so I do this, right? Now, also, remember the camera is out and for everybody to see. If I see something that I don't think people want to take a photograph, I might sneak a photo of it or something or other, but I won't show that photo, just for me to kind of understand what's happening. Waving to people, saying hello, trying to be like one of the people. Some places you don't have really much problem because they're tourist places. You're more difficult when you get off the tourist place, which I tend to do. So I'll walk through the area where everybody is, but then I'll walk down the side streets, etc. And I did that also in China. I had no problem there as well. And that's the method, right? And then what I do is I go back home, right, or wherever it is that I go, and I take notes. Right, write down things that I think are important from that, and then at a later point, I then go over the photographs, right, and look at them from the point of view what's important here, what's not important, etc. Right now, I have tens of thousands of photographs, and I've only gotten around to just the other day, trying to put them in some order. I want to do them by year. I want to do them by place. I want to do them by subject, like gentrification or Chinatown or poverty or homelessness. Because I've unfortunately, you see homeless people all over the world. So that's a method, right? That's a method of collecting data. But remember, a method of collecting data is not simply pure empiricism, right? What goes into it beforehand is all the study. Before you do this, you have the training. Before you do this, you have the theories. You've read people you agree with, people you disagree with, people who have spoken about the place, and you also have an idea about why you're doing it. Now for me, right, as my mentor, his name is Felix Gross, died when he was 100 years old. A wonderful man. So anyhow, so that's my method. So it's studying, right? It's simple photography. I call it snapshots, and then the snapshot they become. So the original data is looking, I'm interpreting, and then later on I look at my photographs. And if you continue connection with me, I'm happy to share. If you read the Seeing Cities Change book, you see there's photographs in there. That's from a selection of maybe 10,000 photographs.
Oh, very
And
interesting.
so, and so the ones that are chosen, there are 62 photographs in that one, but they're chosen specifically for those topics.
So the last question is how ethnic, religious and racial conflicts affects the effectiveness of or fates of cities overall?
Yeah, that's an important question. I think in many cities today, because of the influxes of new people. But for me, you have to start before that happens. In other words, so what is the culture of the city? If we're talking about a city, not a country, right? We're talking about a city. Cities have distinct cultures also. They share a lot of things in common with each other, but they have different cultures. So the culture of the city, I in fact had developed a course one time called not the culture of cities, but the cultures, plural, of cities, because they have different cultures. Mm-hmm. They have different historical experiences. They have different groups, different economics, different politics, etc. Right, so that's the first thing that makes a difference. It's one of the reasons why New York City does so much better in terms of immigration of groups than other cities, because it is a city that has centuries old experience with it. There are other cities like that too in the United States. So New York City has a pretty open culture of acceptance of difference. It doesn't mean love of difference. It means toleration of difference, right? It's toleration, being tolerant and toleration. It's also because the city recognizes the importance of having new people coming in, right? So it's not simply, being nice, being a good person, but recognizing that in order for New York City to do well, it must attract new people. In fact, there are studies that show that the cities in the United States, at least, that have done the best during the terrible economics we've had since the 1970s, have been the cities which have attracted immigration, right? So they attract, in other words, so this positive immigration has been positive, right? So part of this reason of openness to it is this recognition. The business community realizes it in so many ways. And now, even though there might be frictions in different parts of the city, right, with the different groups. So, not all groups are as open to difference as other groups, right? The cultures are different. As I explained to you in terms of Italian Americans, mentioned to you in terms of Orthodox Jews, right? So segments of the cities may not respond that way, but still change takes place. Right now in New York City, the newest large immigrant group, which hadn't been large in the past, is the Asian group, right? So it's interesting to see there's some friction in some areas. And as you can imagine, it's friction in areas where Italian American population, Orthodox Jewish population, other populations which are more homogeneous and they're not necessarily violent, right? There's another interesting thing too you might want to think about, is that this gentrification is also a change, right? So there are some sections, particularly in some of the African American communities, where people are resistant to young white people moving into their neighborhood, right? That's sometimes called a kind of a settler colonialism they talk about. So that's a friction too. But as long as New York City, right, as long as this overall culture of acceptance of difference and change predominates, all right? The city not only will survive, it will thrive because of the change. If it gets stagnant, if people are not coming, that's when the city is in decline. And I think this project, from what I've seen, is a wonderful project, right? And it can be an educational resource for people at all levels. I tried to speak to you in both as an academic, but also as a, just person to person, and that's one of the things that I've been complimented on, is that often when I give a presentation, it's easily understood, But I really don't have anything to add other than say that I'm very grateful that you gave me this opportunity to speak to you and your colleague, who I assume is in the room. And so we say, do svidaniya.
So, thank you very much for your time, and have a good day.